In this video I'm going to be showing you how I built this really rather nice looking headphone stand. As you can see, it's got RGB LEDs built in so that it can change colour, and the headphones can just slide on like so. Now, as you might imagine, this particular design would have been pretty hard to have made by hand, which is why it was made with a CNC router. CNC stands for Computer Numerical Control, and basically means that the router is entirely controlled by a computer. This means that you can get incredibly accurate and detailed cuts, which of course opens a whole new world of project opportunities. Now, the CNC router that I used is called the X-Carve, and it's from Inventables. I'll be giving you my thoughts on this router later in the video, so stay tuned for that because this is one beast of a machine. So with the headphone stand, the first step was of course to come up with a design. I did this to scale on paper so that I could compare it to my headphones to get the size right. Once I was happy with it, I then scanned it into the computer and imported it into a fantastic vector graphics editor called Inkscape, which also happens to be free. Here it was just a case of using the pen tool to carefully sketch around my design and mirroring it to ensure that it was symmetrical. I then saved it as an SVG file so that it could be imported into the X-Carve's control software, which is called Easel. Here I changed the material type to walnut, which is the wood I chose to use. Changing the material type automatically adjusts the speed and depth of each cutting pass, which are fairly important factors, so it's great to have some options to choose from. I then aligned the cutting bit with the bottom left corner of the material and initiated the carving process. For a first-time CNC user like me, it was quite exciting seeing it cut out my design by itself. Now, because of the thickness of the wood, it had to do quite a few passes to cut all the way through it, so it did take quite a while, but the end result was pretty much flawless. The process was repeated until all the walnut layers were cut. As you can see, the inner layers were painted white, and this was done so that the LEDs, which reflect into the acrylic, would appear a little bit brighter. Things got a little bit more complicated when it came to cut the acrylic, because it started melting at the slightest heat, which caused blobs to form and make a mess. Now, I later found out that this was because I was using extruded acrylic rather than cast acrylic, but at the time using an upcut bit along with vacuuming away the waste did help a lot. Once all the pieces were cut, the thing that struck me the most was how similar they all were. It's not surprising, obviously, being computer controlled, but it was still pretty awesome to see. The acrylic layers in particular were really cool, and I'm already getting tons of ideas of future projects that could use it. Computer case Mark III, anyone? Now with all of the pieces finally cut, I sandwiched them together using some long bolts. These thread through the very front layer, making the structure really strong. As the edges were still a little rough, I gave it a vigorous sanding down. This blended the layers together really well, and at this point it became really quite a solid unit. The next step was perhaps the most rewarding because it was finally time to add the oil. This adds colour and contrast to the wood and gives it quite a glossy look. It took around 10 coats to get it to how I wanted it, but I think you'll agree, it looks pretty splendid. A side effect of adding the oil was that the acrylic lost its diffused look, becoming a little bit too clear for my needs. So I carefully masked the wood and gently sanded the acrylic until it became diffused again. This left me with one last thing to do, which was to finally add the LEDs. I decided to use some RGB LED strips for these because they're already quite thin and very bright. After cutting off 3 sets of 3, which is the shortest length you can cut these strips, I got an old headphone cable and soldered them to it. The reason I chose a headphone cable was because A, it was really thin, and B, it had 4 wires inside, which made it perfect for each of the colour channels, plus the power line. These were powered by a cheap RGB LED strip controller, which came with a remote control. To mount the LEDs to the stand, I stuck them to a sheet of very thin aluminium, which was then screwed to the bottom. I had prepared for this beforehand by making sure that the inner layers had a slight indentation for the LEDs to fit into. Being mounted to aluminium also means that the LEDs are kept nice and cool, which should improve their longevity. The last thing to do was plug it in and try it out. The LEDs lit up the acrylic perfectly, and the remote allowed me to choose pretty much any colour I liked. So as I mentioned earlier, this particular design would have been almost impossible to have made by hand, so I'm very grateful to Inventables for sending me an X-Carve to make it with. Now, as the X-Carve was featured heavily in this video, it's only fitting that I give you my thoughts about it, because it's, quite frankly, an amazing tool. Now, it did require some construction because it was dispatched in parts. This isn't a bad thing though, because it did cut down on shipping costs, and allowed me to get to know how it all worked as I put it together. The process was actually quite smooth thanks to a step-by-step online guide, which included videos. Pretty handy, as being a guy, well, we don't read manuals, so yeah. That said, it's not perfect, and I did find the instructions slightly unclear at times. This is why it's a good idea to start with the right mindset. This isn't a consumer device where it fits together as flawlessly as Lego, but it's more like a project in itself, where you actually have to use your own initiative and your brain whilst you put it together. For example, using braided sheathing is a good way to keep the cables tidy, as is rearranging the control box layout slightly to avoid a mess of cables. Now, speaking of this box, it did seem to be a bit of a loose end at first, but after using the X-Carve for a while, I can see why it's not permanently attached, and that's so you can work it into a convenient spot in your workplace, or kitchen in my case, keeping it out of the way of any dust and debris. Now, once it was all together, it just worked, and as you saw earlier, it's really easy to get carving things right away. I honestly didn't know what to expect, having never used a CNC before, but considering the lengthy build process, I'm amazed that there were no serious teething problems, which is a testament to its design, I suppose. Now, it's obviously not just limited to cutting wood and acrylic either. One other project I've attempted is etching my own PCBs for a microphone project. This was a really good test of its accuracy, because the cuts involved here were in the order of fractions of millimeters, and it did a perfect job. So I can honestly say that my scope for projects has increased dramatically because of the X-Carve, and if you're in the market for a CNC, I really can't recommend it enough. So that's it for this video. I really enjoyed working on this one, and I think the stand turned out really well. If you enjoyed this video too, don't forget to hit that like button, and maybe consider subscribing. By the way, if you're thinking that the audio sounds better than usual in this video, that's because I'm using the aforementioned microphone project to narrate it with. So if you've not seen it yet, why not check it out by clicking the I at the top right of the screen. I hope I see you there.